Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about unemployment. It's chapter 8 in the OpenStax macroeconomic textbook, and unemployment is when we have people looking for work. We want to get deeper into this idea. So you're probably familiar with some aspects of unemployment, but we're going to look at the economic perspective because that's what we do here. We've already talked about this a little bit when we looked at labor markets back in chapter 4, talking about how price floors like the minimum wage law can lead to unemployment. If the price floor is set above the median wage, we're going to have the quantity supplied of labor exceed the quantity demanded. Now we're going to talk more about the kinds of unemployment we see. We're going to look at how economists define unemployment, what their expectations are, and there's going to be different types of unemployment. The other thing that I think is really important in this chapter is to learn what unemployment really is. When we talk about the unemployment rate, what are we really measuring? We're going to talk about the labor force participation rate. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why we might see unemployment fluctuate during periods of economic turmoil. And it's going to get us started talking about this thing called the business cycle, understanding that there are periods of economic downturn and upturn, and what some of the indicators we're familiar with and we're going to use to build our economic models are going to look like when the economy is strong and when the economy is weak. So let's get into it. This is chapter 8 in the OpenStax textbook. Like I said, there's a lot of new terminology here. Adverse selection of wage cuts, cyclical employment, discouraged workers, efficiency wage theory. I love efficiency wage theory. Insider-outsider model, implicit contract, relative wage coordination, natural rate of unemployment, underemployment, all of those things we're going to define today. So grab your notes, grab your slides, grab your book, and let's get started. Oh, there we go. All right, now let's get started. So there are going to be some variations between, if you're like me and you like the physical book, it's going to be the second edition. The slides are going to reference the third edition and going to be updated online if you're referencing the online book. But most of that stuff's going to be minor details, and we'll address it as we go through. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to be talking about how economists define unemployment, how they calculate the unemployment rate, what it means. We're going to talk about patterns we expect to see in the economy with unemployment. And that's going to mean what expectations we have for employment and unemployment based on age, race, gender, and also over time. And then we're going to talk about changes in unemployment, looking at the short run and then the long run. And that's because that's what we like to do in the economy. In economics is really divide things out to short run and long run, especially as we dive deeper into our macroeconomic models. The idea of what's possible in the macroeconomy in the short run is going to be very different from what's possible in the macroeconomy in the long run. And to that point, in the second edition textbook, they talk about unemployment and the Great Recession. We can think about unemployment during the pandemic and how there were periods of very steep and sharp unemployment. In the pandemic, it was steep, sharp, and not very long. With the Great Recession, there was a lot of unemployment that lasted a really long time. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but we also saw a lot of people leave the labor force. In the slides, however, they talk about the idea of replacement, the idea that people are being replaced by robots. And I think it's funny that they start out with jobs in factories being replaced by robots. But the reality is a lot of jobs have the capacity to be replaced by some kind of automation with the evolution of AI and computing. And so it starts to, kind of beg the question, what kind of jobs are there going to be in the future? And will I be employable in the future, right? So we're going to try to answer some of that today and talk about what kind of unemployment we see. So first, we have to define and calculate the unemployment rate. And so what we want to remember is we're going to be talking about 3 different parts of the adult population. We're only looking at adults, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other economists will usually sometimes differentiate between people 18 and older or 25 and older. But generally, we're talking about adults, and we're going to categorize them as one of 3 kinds of people. They can be employed, which means they are currently working for pay, whether it's salaried, wage, part-time, full-time, any of that kind of thing. Working for pay counts as employed. To be counted as unemployed, you need to not be employed and actively looking for a job. And that's an important distinction that's not always talked about outside of economics. But to be counted in the unemployment rate, you have to be collecting unemployment and reporting to an employment agency that you are looking for a job. If you're not employed and you're not out of work but seeking employment, then you are our third option, which is out of the labor force. People not in the labor force or out of the labor force are not looking for work and not working. So there's a couple of different ways that this could work. It could be people who are doing unpaid domestic labor at home, so stay-at-home parents. It could be students who don't work. And it could be what we call, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, people who we call discouraged workers, people who are out of the labor force and wish they could get a job but have given up. But the labor force is just going to be all of our people who count as employed or unemployed. And then adults who are not in the labor force are out of the labor force. So when we calculate our unemployment rate, what we're going to do is we are going to look at the percent of employed people out of the total labor force. So to calculate our unemployment rate, we want to take, to calculate our unemployment rate, we want to look at the number of unemployed people divided by the total labor force times 100 to get a percentage. So if we have thousands of people in the labor force and some of them are unemployed, we divide that number by that number and we get a percentage. We get a decimal and we convert it to a percentage by multiplying it by 100. People who aren't unemployed don't count as the labor force. And so another way to think of this is that the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed people divided by unemployed people plus employed people. So it does not include those people who are out of the labor force. So the unemployment rate is counting the percentage of people in the labor force who are seeking work. And it actually ends up being a pretty small portion of our labor force. So up here you have data from January 2021. If you look in the book, I've got older data that looks pretty similar. This is January 2017, but the numbers are pretty similar. In my book, the number of employed people is 152,081. Unemployed people is 7,635. And out of the labor force is 94,366. In 2021, you can see on the slides, the numbers are a little bit different, but the proportions are about the same. And that's what we tend to see. Unemployed people are a pretty small portion of the total workforce. So when we think about things like the unemployment rate being 4 or 5%, that sounds about right to us. What might be something you didn't expect was to see so many people out of the labor force. Those are going to be people who aren't working for a wage. So like I said, they could be doing uncompensated household labor. So stay-at-home parents, people who are staying home to take care or be a caregiver for a relative, a family, or a friend. People who are students, people who are on disability. And then people who have given up on finding work. So if we look at this, we can see that unemployed people are a pretty small proportion of the total adult population. But what else is going on here? So the book asks you the question, what is the unemployment rate? So that kind of might be a weird question. Another question that I sometimes ask my students is, let's say we have 3 people. and they're all looking for a job. Person A is looking for a job and finds one. They become employed. So if we think of it this way, we have our 3 people looking for a job, and I'm going to populate them down here. So we have 1, 2, 3 people in the labor force, and they're unemployed. When one of them finds a job, they go away from here and they come here. That's going to lower the unemployment rate. There are fewer unemployed people. One of them still can't find a job. They keep looking. That's going to keep the unemployment rate the same. What if the third person can't find a job but gives up looking for work? That's going to make the unemployment rate look better. When people stop trying to find work, they stop being unemployed and they leave the labor force. And that can make it look like unemployment is improving when really we have a different kind of problem. And that kind of problem is what we like to call discouraged workers. One of the big problems with unemployment is that the unemployment rate does not measure discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are just those who have stopped looking for employment, either because they've given up, they don't think there's any suitable positions. There's specific kinds of employment that we'll talk about that tend to lead to discouraged workers. The other things that can happen, the other problems with the unemployment rate are things like part-time or temporary workers who would like to have full-time work. Workers who might not be using all their resources right. I was just speaking to a friend of mine, and she has 2 degrees. She has a degree in English and she has a degree in chemistry, and she's an apartment manager. So she's employed, but is she doing the job that she was trained for? No, not quite. So when we think about hidden unemployment, things that the unemployment rate doesn't measure, we can think about discouraged workers and people who are underemployed. Either they are not working at a job that uses their full skill set, or in some cases, they simply are seeking full-time work and can only find part-time or temporary work. And so that's going to look like they're employed, but they're not employed to the way they would like to be. They're not employed to the capacity they'd like to be. So how do we measure these things? There's a couple of ways we measure them. The main way we measure them is using statistics. And so what we'll use is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who goes out and collects this data. They collect data on who works, where, and how. The other thing they calculate in addition to the unemployment rate is what's called the labor force participation rate. And the labor force participation rate, or the LFP, is going to be a measure of that discouraged worker rate, right? It's going to be the total labor force divided by the adult population. Times 100 to make it a percentage. So if we go back and use my example before of 3 people looking for work, 1 becomes employed and 1 becomes a discouraged worker, over here they would still all be in the adult population, right? I'll put them here. 1, 2, 3. But only 2 of them would be in the labor force, the unemployed and the employed person. And so that's a way where we're measuring the percentage of people who are participating in the labor force, either by working or seeking work. And it's telling us who's not being counted here and here. So if we wanted to, we can look at the data for this and calculate these numbers for ourselves. The book asks us to look at November 2021 statistics, but let's go a little more modern. Let's look at 2023. So give me a second and we'll pull up the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, so got a clean slate here. And I am at the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. So it's just bls.gov. And they collect tons of data on things like employment, but also prices, payroll, productivity, imports, and exports. But we want to look at employment data. And so we're going to look at the most recent data on unemployment. And you can tell that these are very serious economists because their reports are so boring looking. So if you look here at the employment situation summary, this is probably the most boring government webpage you've ever seen. And you can scroll through the data here, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is go ahead and download the PDF version so it's a little bit more attractive. So that's going to be right here. So this is the news release for the Bureau of Labor Statistics from August of 2023. And we can see here the unemployment rate declining from August of 21 on. We can see payroll over a period of 2 years. And then we can scroll down and we can start to see some numbers. And so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down here to the household data. And here they give us data for August of 2022, June of 2023, July of 2023, and August of 2023. We have the change in numbers here, the change in rates. We have unemployment rates for different populations. You can see the unemployment rate for teenagers is higher than it is for people over their 20s. You can see unemployment rate by race, by level of education. You're going to tend to see your unemployment rate fall as people get a higher level of education. And then reasons why they're unemployed. Did you leave a job? Did you lose a job? Did you enter the new market? Those kinds of things. So there's a lot of data here. What we want to look at is we want to calculate the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate on our own. And they're here so we can check ourselves. That's what we're going to be looking for. But what I want to do is I want to take this civilian non-institutional population. So basically everybody who's an adult and could be in the labor force, right? That's our adult population. And that is going to be 267,213. We also have here the civilian, labor force. Let me make that a little bit bigger for y'all. The civilian labor force is 167,839. We have the labor force participation rate, but I want to look at the number of people who are employed and unemployed and not in the labor force. And that's going to give me the numbers I want. So people in the labor force, let's do this. Number of people employed, unemployed is going to be 6,355. And then people who are considered not in the labor force, that's going to be 99,374. And then the labor force, which is this number plus this number, or this number minus this number, is going to be 167,839. I don't know why that's giving me trouble today. So we have our total adult population. We have our adult labor force. So this number minus this number, or these two numbers make that number. And then we have our unemployed people. So what we want to do is go ahead and calculate first the unemployment rate. So remember, unemployment rate is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So if you calculate that 6,355 divided by 167,839, you're going to get 0.03786 or so. If we multiply that by 100, we get 3.79 rounding up percent, which is about what we get here, right? If we rounded it to the first decimal, that's 3.8%, just like the BLS calculated. Now we can calculate the labor force participation rate. And that's going to be the percent of the population that is either employed or unemployed, the percent of the population that participates in the labor force. So it's going to be the labor force, which is 167,839, divided by the adult population, 267,213. If you divide 167,839 by 267,213, you get 0.6281. If you multiply that by 100, you get 62.8%, which is exactly what the BLS calculated. So there you go. That is more recent data on the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. Okay, so now we've practiced calculating those figures, and you can go through and look up the most current data right now or look up historical data and calculate the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate for yourself. What we do see historically are patterns of unemployment. We tend to see the unemployment rate move up and down over time. And we consider that to be sort of the fluctuations of the business cycle. It does tend to be within a pretty narrow range, though. If you look, the tippity top here is 10%, and the bottom is about 2%. Generally between 4 and 6 is about where we expect it. And that's a trend we expect to persist. When we have even our biggest economic crises, like the Great Recession, that's right here. It's still sort of within what our normal expectations are for unemployment. A lot higher than it was in previous recessions, but still pretty manageable. And then pretty low leading up to the pandemic, when again, it would obviously spike again. There does not seem an overall trend for unemployment rate to be going up or down overall. It's just this fluctuation in between. But that doesn't mean that's telling us the whole story. That means that we tend to see generally movement of unemployment up and down, while there are definitely winners and losers in this. We can also look at the fluctuations by demographic group. So if we look here, we can see the gender differences between men and women's unemployment rates. And of course, you want to remember this isn't taking into consideration labor force participation rate. That's a whole different story. Over time, we've seen women increase their labor force participation, men decrease it. But you can see unemployment rates for men used to be lower than for women, and now we see them sometimes be higher, especially in the Great Recession. So historically, they do tend to be pretty similar, but there are some periods where you see a big gap. We can also look at the unemployment rate by age. The youngest people tend to have the highest unemployment rates, whereas older people tend to have much lower unemployment rates. And there's a couple of things going on there. One thing we expect is that the older you get, the more experience you have, the more valuable a worker you are, so the less likely you are to be unemployed for an amount of time, especially a long time. And then the other thing we want to expect is that as you get older, the likelihood that you move from unemployed to not in the labor force is going to increase as you retire. We can also look at the unemployment rate by race, and we see pretty distinct disparities with the trends replicated over time. So we tend to always see Black unemployment be much higher than white unemployment, and Hispanic unemployment be somewhere in the middle. And that's a trend that's persisted for decades. But we see the trend replicate through that, right? The peaks of unemployment during recessions are the same. The valleys of unemployment, the lows of unemployment when the economy is doing well, are the same sort of trajectory, even if the levels are really very different. And we have seen a shrinking of the gap in recent years compared to previous periods. We can also look at the international comparison and compare unemployment in the United States to other countries. The United States tends to have a pretty good looking unemployment rate compared to other countries, but it's really complicated to do that because different countries have different definitions. They use different tools to collect and survey this data, and they have very different labor markets and very different labor contracts. So in some countries, it might be harder or easier to fire someone or hire someone, and that's going to have an effect on these numbers. So that cross-country comparison can be pretty problematic. So now we want to look at what causes changes in unemployment in the short run. And so in the short run, we're going to be looking at periods of those economic up and downturns. And we have a special term for unemployment that happens in those downturns and those upticks. That's what we call cyclical unemployment. And the idea is that that kind of unemployment follows the business cycle. It's unemployment tied to the business cycle, and it tends to just go up and down in that cyclical nature when we have recessions, when we have periods of economic expansion. So if we think about it this way, it's sort of, and we'll talk about this more when we get into our big, heavy macro models of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and because it might not make sense right now, but what we tend to see is there are going to be periods where in a recession, unemployment is much higher than it would be in a period of economic well-being. So we can try to use our labor market model to help us understand that. In a perfect world with very flexible wages, we would expect that the labor market will adjust. Supply and demand will adjust to achieve that equilibrium wage, and so we shouldn't see high rates of unemployment. But what we know is that that's not true. We get high rates of unemployment in the short run. And we think there might be a couple of reasons. There's a couple of ways we can try to explain that. The first one is what we call sticky downward wages. And the idea here is that wages don't change as much as the model might suggest. So if you think about jobs you've had or people you've known had, usually jobs pay a certain wage and it doesn't change a lot. You might get periodic wage increases, raises, but it's not going to be, at the very most, it'd be annual, and usually it's a little bit less often than that. It's also really uncommon for wages to drop. And so if wages don't usually go down, if you don't see a lot of income cuts or salary cuts, then that means that the market's not going to do a good job of adjusting wages in response to changing economic conditions. So if wages stay stuck at that above equilibrium level, even though the market conditions have changed, maybe a recession means falling demand, so the equilibrium wage is lower than it used to be, we're going to be stuck at that level. And let me just give you a quick sense of what that looks like, because I think it's hard to see it on your own. So what we're saying here is that if we're in a market, for a labor market, and we're in equilibrium, let's say this is the market for car salespeople. And we're in equilibrium first with some level of demand for that labor and some level of supply for that labor and some equilibrium. I already don't like this example. Let's just assume. Let's assume that you are a car salesperson and you're on salary and you don't make commission, and then there's an economic recession. Recession means incomes fall, demand for cars goes down. That means demand for people selling cars or making cars is going to go down. So the new equilibrium wage is actually down here. That's our new equilibrium. But if wages stay stuck up here, then we're going to see this be additional unemployment because what firms will do, rather than lower the wages for all workers, they'll lay a few workers off or not hire workers when they normally would. And so that sticky downward wages is going to lead to higher rates of unemployment in a period when incomes are low. So wages might be sticky for, there might be reasons why wages are sticky. It could be that there's an implicit contract, an unwritten agreement between an employer and an employee that wages just aren't going to adjust that much so that employees don't feel the burden of downturns, but they also don't get all the benefit of an upturn. The other idea is what's called efficiency wage theory. And this idea says that firms have to pay workers a higher wage to keep the best workers. And so because of those higher than equilibrium wages, we're going to see periods of unemployment. And then the other problem might be what's called adverse selection of wage cuts. And the idea here is that if an employer says, oh, wow, there's been a downturn, I need to cut wages, who's going to leave? The best workers or the worst workers? If you reduce wages, the people who have the best labor market options will be the first ones out the door, and you'll be left with paying these equilibrium wages to the worst workers. Whereas you might prefer to pay higher wages to all the workers so you don't lose the worst workers or lose the best workers and maybe lay a few people off or stop hiring. And so this idea that if you cut wages, you'll lose your best workers, you'll adversely select the worst workers in your situation can lead to that downward stickiness of wages. The other things we could see, what's called insider-outsider model, and this is just kind of the idea that once you're in, you're good. It basically says that people who are inside the firm already know the procedures and are going to be less likely to be laid off or harmed by a recession because of training costs and maybe institutional knowledge, just kind of knowing what they know. And then outsiders are going to be the sort of most recent hires or people they were about to hire. They're going to be easier to lay off than harming your insiders, your well-known workers with lower wages. And then the last explanation economists have for this stickiness of downward wages, the downward stickiness of wages, is what's known as relative wage coordination argument. And this is the idea that it's really, really hard to go and tell your company, listen, we're cutting everybody's wages across the board. It would lead to a lot of outcry and really coordinated movement by the workers. And so firms really don't want to do that. So those are a few reasons why we might see that. And here's an example of exactly what I was kind of saying. So when we have a period of economic expansion, wages, the equilibrium wage might rise, and we might see some stickiness to that. On the other hand, when we see a decrease in demand, we might still see that stickiness and see unemployment prevail as demand fluctuates in the period of economic recession. So, what about in a period? This answers our question of how we see unemployment in the short run. It's going to tend to be that cyclical unemployment. It's going to be in response to a downturn in the economy, and it's going to be a little bit of a failure of the market forces of supply and demand in the labor market, usually because of one of these causes of the stickiness of downward wages. What about in the long run? In the long run, what we're going to see are that we can have other explanations for unemployment. So the first thing we want to think about is this idea of a natural rate of unemployment. And this might seem crazy because you're kind of thinking, well, no, unemployment's a bad thing. What does natural rate of unemployment mean? And it's basically just the idea that there's always someone looking for a job in a healthy economy. It's actually a sign of a healthy economy that people are looking for jobs. And one of those great examples of that is what we call frictional unemployment. And frictional unemployment comes from this idea that there's friction associated with movement. So if you are in a job that you hate, frictional unemployment is you looking for a new job. That's not a bad thing. You're seeking a better outcome, a better match. That's going to increase in efficiency. If you are using a job, taking a job right now while you're a student, and then when you graduate, you plan on a new job, there's going to be a period of unemployment. That friction of moving from a bad fit to a better fit is good for the economy, but it means that there will be some unemployment at some time. And that's something that we actually like to see. So frictional unemployment occurs when workers are moving between jobs. It's that friction of them moving between jobs. And it means that there's always going to be some amount of unemployment as everyone in the, the 267,000 workers in the US are finding their best fit. The other kind of unemployment that can influence the natural rate of unemployment is what's called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment occurs when individuals don't have the skills employers want. So these are going to be people for whom maybe the structure of the economy changed, or they are not fitting into the employment structure because they just don't have what it takes. So if you think about, my favorite example of this is if you know what a VCR is, it used to be the way we played movies. If I was a VCR repair person, I would be structurally unemployed because there just aren't enough VCRs to repair anymore. That technology is not used anymore. So structural unemployment is going to occur when there are changes in technology. But usually we can see a way through structural unemployment with policy. We can have training and education programs that take workers who are structurally unemployed and make them employable. And so there's a solution to that. But generally, economists consider an economy to be at full unemployment when the actual unemployment rate is below the natural rate. The tricky part is, what is the natural rate of unemployment? People debate. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 3%, maybe it's 2%. We tend to think it's somewhere around in between that 2 to 4 range. So here you can see productivity shifts and the natural rate of unemployment. Over time, we're going to tend to see productivity increase, right? We're going to see technology increase the productivity of the average worker. As that productivity increases, the value marginal product of the worker increases, and the demand for that labor is going to shift up. As the demand shifts out, we're going to see wages tend to increase. Over time, employers and workers become used to that pattern of wage increases. If productivity lags or stops, or there's a perception that productivity is lagging, then we might see firms be unwilling to give workers their sort of expected wage increase. And so then we can see what ends up happening is people choose to leave to look for something better. We can also see if the productivity increases have been low for a long time. Workers might choose to just accept the equilibrium wage level, and then an increase in productivity in the case of Model 2, where we don't see productivity change and then a sudden change. That movement is going to mean that the quantity of labor demanded is going to exceed the quantity supplied, and we'll have unemployment be really, really low. So if you think about a big economic expansion, big economic growth, big technology, we can see a period where wages are lagging behind demand. And in a period where people get really used to expecting economic growth, we can see a period where demand is lagging behind supply. Cool? So what do we do about the natural rate of unemployment? On the supply side, there's actually a lot of public policies we can use. We have things like unemployment insurance to reduce the pressure of frictional unemployment, make it affordable for people to find the best job. We have our social safety net programs, things like welfare benefits, food stamps, and medical benefits available to people who are unemployed and people with low incomes to help make that burden of unemployment lower and make it possible for workers to find a good job. The other problem is we do have this idea that we don't want to have unemployment insurance benefits to be too high because we don't want to disincentivize workers to look for a new job. What seems to matter the most is that length of benefits. And so we're always looking at how to tailor benefits policies to remove the burden of unemployment without incentivizing people to stay unemployed. So the other thing we see government assistance programs that can help make workers more attractive, and sort of make the supply of workers more robust. So we're going to see things like job search programs, retraining programs, programs that help transition people from an industry that's no longer lucrative to a new industry. Those kinds of things are going to be really good at helping with that structural unemployment. On the demand side, the other things we can do is try to make firms more willing to hire. We can have different regulations, right? If it's easier to hire people, then firms are going to hire them more quickly. We can also try to create social institutions to get people hired. One of the things we do is subsidize education to make sure workers are qualified for modern jobs. We also see the presence of unions have an effect on employment, wages, and job quality, and that's going to really affect the labor market too. In recent years, the natural rate of unemployment has been estimated at being between 4.5% and 5.5%, which is lower than we usually think. And economists aren't sure, is this a temporary thing? Is this truly a long-term thing? Is this a product of the high rate of technological growth we've been experiencing? It could be just because of things like the internet, lowering the cost associated with searching for a job. Before the internet, people would have to search want ads in the newspaper. But now you can search for jobs anywhere in the world at a really, really low cost. We also see a lot of growth in temporary working positions, making it easier for people to find another job while they're looking for a longer term job. And then the other thing we know is that just our demographics are changing. We had a large portion of the population working, the baby boomer generation, and they're now retiring. And that's leaving a lot of jobs open for the smaller age cohorts that are coming of age. And so that means that we are going to see sort of fewer workers in the workforce going forward. So that's it. That's unemployment. Hopefully you feel like you have a better sense of what unemployment means, what the unemployment rate is actually telling us, what the labor force participation rate is, and why we expect some level of unemployment in a healthy economy. Let me know what questions you have. Let me know what examples you'd like to see, what you thought was interesting, what you thought was boring, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks. Have a great day.